Hey internets, it appears the hashtag #MeToo movement is trending again, albeit for a very different reason than the usual. Here's a TLDR of some recent drama slop. Dean Withers, a guy who's relatively well known for being a pro-Kamala left-leaning influencer, has been recently accused of some crimes of the perverted nature. Crimes that he vehemently denies doing. And I'm not here to say whether he's guilty or not. The point here really comes down to the problem that Dean Withers is also on record as one of those people who just say that you should believe all victims regardless of evidence, or the whole listen and believe meme. This is something he's used in debates before, basically implying that people he doesn't like are guilty of sex crimes simply because they've been quote-unquote credibly accused of them, which doesn't actually mean there's any evidence. And so thus the question of the week comes down to this poll I held earlier. Do male feminists who repeat the believe all victims rhetoric deserve to be roasted with unfalsifiable SA accusations until they admit they are wrong? Yep, how's that for a philosophical and ethical question of the day? And I should really point out that I do not ask this question lightly, because I myself have been falsely accused in the past. I worked an IT job and this one woman falsely accused me of assaulting her in the woman's bathroom, with the weirdest thing about it being it was a woman I didn't even really know existed, and apparently the reason she did it is because I was giving attention to a different girl. How dare I have the audacity to give attention to a woman who was not her, and therefore in her twisted little mind that meant I deserved to be falsely accused of grapes. It's just really weird how petty some people can be about this kind of thing. Now, fortunately for me, it was a falsifiable accusation. There was just no video evidence of me doing that, and so the whole thing got swept under the rug in under a week, and it ended up not really being that big of a deal. But not all men are as lucky as me when it comes to being falsely accused. Sometimes accusations are not falsifiable, and it's easy to see how deeply isolating of an experience that would be. And so when it comes to Dean Withers and this question, one of the better replies I got is this one from Sir Devon. This is honestly a tough one to answer. It feels like a question of forcing one of the believe all victims people to experience exactly what we're talking about, but on the same token, I still really don't think anyone should have to go through that. Then again, if you don't make an example out of people, they'll never learn. It's a terrible crossroads. And to add to this, false accusations generally are just not good, because the very fact that they exist is one of the reasons that we have this problem. Because when it comes to harassment, I can absolutely understand the problem from the woman's perspective, or really just any victim's perspective. Because of course you have the reverse problem, where you have a woman at work who's assaulted by some pervert, and their HR department did absolutely nothing about it. And then they're stuck in this terrible position where they're stuck working with someone who is a predator, and you don't want to be around that person. And that sucks too. And so how do you reconcile this issue between people who get harassed, but also people who get falsely accused? The answer is simple and comes down to three components. 1, falsifiable evidence. 2, falsifiable evidence. And 3, falsifiable evidence. Okay, obviously I'm joking here, but really, it's just one very important thing, falsifiable evidence. And yet people strangely seem to forget about that. The saddest thing here is the fact that I even have to make this video, because it feels like the phrase evidence matters should be an obvious phrase to any rational human being. And yet years after hashtag #MeToo, we still see people like Dean Withers to whom this very obvious thing is somehow not obvious to them until they are crashing headfirst into the logical conclusions of their poor reasoning skills. And thus, even as someone who has had to deal with a false accusation myself, it's really hard to feel sorry for this guy, because it seems that some people will just never learn unless they learn the hard way. A lot of these people still do not get what the problem is with Me Too. The whole falsifiability issue just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. Like for example in this clip right here from Dean.
Oh, okay, so he wasn't criminally charged.
Right.
So that's the end of the story, right?
Why is that the end of the story? What a dumb
She was
statement.
just looking for money. Why didn't she do it before?
Why didn't she do it before? Well, I mean, according to RAINN.org, only around 2% of rapists are ever held fully accountable in the eyes of the law, and only around, and on top of that, 60% of women who are raped never reported to the authorities in their lifetime. So I don't understand why we'd sit here and victim blame a woman who waited 23 years. But predominantly the reason why she waited so long has to do with the negative outcomes of rape culture. Rape culture blames victims for being publicly outspoken about the fact that they were raped. Rape culture punishes victims for being publicly outspoken about the fact that they were raped.
Okay, so there's a lot of problems with what he just said. Some of them, such as the issue of grape culture, could easily deserve its own video explaining why there really isn't any such culture in Western society in the modern day. But since the point of this video is to explain the main issue with Me Too and what they still don't really understand, I'm just going to focus on the lack of understanding of falsifiability that is implied here. Because criticizing a victim for waiting 20 plus years to come forward, that's not blaming them for what allegedly happened, but rather it's calling out an issue that arises from the necessity of having standards of evidence. And the standard is not by any means a bad thing, but rather it's something that every courtroom needs in order to remain serious and grounded in reality, with falsifiability being a concept that the courts borrow from modern science. For example, can you, the person watching this video right now, prove that there is not a magical, invisible, pink monkey floating above your head right now? No, seriously, how would you disprove that? And well, the obvious answer is you can't. I mean, how would you? What even test is there to test for a magical, invisible pink monkey? The magical properties of it make it invisible to any instrument of measure that we currently have available. But of course, obviously, that doesn't mean that there is a magical, invisible pink monkey above your head. It's just a simple, easy to understand analogy of the problem when something is not falsifiable. Because when you can't falsify something, that means you can't test it, which means it can't really be proven to be true either. I've noticed this when you mention the word falsifiability, especially to people who are relatively uneducated and of low IQ. They hear the word unfalsifiable and they equate that word with, oh, that means it must be true. No, in fact, not being falsifiable means it can't even be taken seriously at all in the court of law. And why this is important to me too is because crimes of sex harassment have a very irritating property, which is that they tend to be more unfalsifiable as time goes on. A lot of the evidence that surrounds that type of crime tends to go away after a few months, after which any biological markers that the alleged assault took place tend to go away, and also any video evidence of the assault, such as from a security camera system, will likely have been deleted and recorded over. And so yes, victims of these kind of crimes, if they want to be taken seriously in a court of law, they need to make sure that their accusation meets the standards of falsifiability, which means you really should come forward relatively quickly if this sort of thing happens to you. Otherwise, all you have left is a he said, she said, which just isn't enough for a prosecutor to go with. And oftentimes what we see on top of this problem is that the accusations that particularly come decades after the fact oftentimes come with no memory of where specifically the assault took place, or even specifically when it took place, which makes it almost impossible to even begin investigating the event. And if we were to ignore this aspect of reality, then that would be effectively implying that the basic concept of requiring evidence somehow counts as blaming the victim, which is just kind of obviously absurd on its face. Because without evidence, the court of law has no way of knowing who really is the victim. Because in the event of a false accusation, it is actually the accused party that is the victim, thus just further emphasizing the need for falsifiable evidence. And if we were to get rid of this requirement when it comes to sexual assault crimes, just to make people who are victims of those crimes feel better, well, that would create some really weird incentives. For example, two people who are working at the same company, let's just imagine hypothetically that both of them are competing for a promotion. Well, in a world where we just immediately believe all victims, regardless of whether or not the evidence is again falsifiable, what's to stop one of these people from simply pointing to the other and then falsely accusing the other of harassing them, refusing to elaborate on what specifically quote unquote that harassment actually is, and thus ejecting them from the company and winning the promotion purely on the back of deception instead of actual merit? Or another example comes from the potential problem of enabling narcissists. People with narcissistic personality disorder tend to be very easily offended, and thus often view completely minute or sometimes even totally imagined slights against them as some kind of less majesty, which highlights the inherent subjective nature of the word harassment. If a woman claims to be harassed, does that mean either a man chased her down in a dark alleyway and forcibly laid his hands on her, which most people would agree is pretty bad, or does harassment mean that a man that she deemed to be unattractive said good morning to her as they were passing by each other on the sidewalk? How dare this moid have the audacity to say hello to me? Hashtag me too. And so that's why you need to have objective standards for what counts as evidence and what counts as a crime. And so thus what we would likely see in a world that just stopped caring about that kind of evidence is we'd likely see false accusations suddenly go up in number by a very massive margin. I mean, heck, why even work at all when you can just falsely accuse people in court and just sue everybody and then immediately win your case because you don't have to prove anything? People in that kind of world could legitimately make a living off of just being a false accuser. It would be very ridiculous, which of course is why we have these standards of evidence in the first place, which then reveals another very big flaw in the reasoning that Dean Withers and a lot of the Me Too movement is guilty of, which is that their entire argument must necessarily rely on the age-old grift of pretending to not understand things. People like Dean Withers or even Sarkeesian in the past with their hashtag listen and believe rhetoric, what they effectively have to do is pretend to not understand the importance of these objective standards, instead opting to resort to the disingenuous debate bro tactics of accusing anyone who brings it up as, again, ma victim blaming, or ma grape apologist, and so on and so forth, effectively just intentionally ignoring the point. And what we're seeing here with the whole Dean Withers drama case of him being accused of being a harasser himself, is we're seeing that it is indeed them just pretending to not understand it. He very well understands it. Now that Dean Withers himself is being blasted with some unfalsifiable accusations, now, all of a sudden, by some mysterious, magical force, he understands the need for said objective standards of evidence to exist. Now, all of a sudden, falsifiability is important again. Because, of course, he probably never really believed his rhetoric. It was never about genuinely defending victims of harassment, but rather it was about pretending to defend those victims, but ultimately just using them as political pawns, as a way to attack their political opposition, with various accusations that they know were not falsifiable. And the saddest part about it is, of course, that this ends up not defending real victims. One of the negative effects of Me Too deciding to just kind of throw logic out the window, allowing obvious grifters to speak for the movement as a whole, is that ultimately people have now ended up taking these kinds of accusations less seriously than before. Pretty pathetic, really. But anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. But thanks again for watching. That is all for now. Till next time.